For over 3,000 years, a mysterious ibix-headed figure has stalked the lonely sands of the Thuvian desert, preying on caravans and assaulting its victims with an endless barrage of their most terrible nightmares made flesh. Today, we're going to discuss the desert's Howl from Monsters of Myth on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am a local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who secretly suspects that some of the writers for Paizo might be trying to slide their musical opinions into the articles that they write for this company, as evidenced by the fact that today's monster literally has an ability called Putrid Evanescence. Come on, that's a harsh critique by any standard. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and welcome to Monsters of Myth, a series where I take a close look at famous monsters inside of the Golarion setting for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Last year, during the month of October, I did a full series on monsters that were featured in the book Monsters of Myth, covering 4 of my favorite monsters from this particular product, such as Spring-Heeled Jack. And then I revisited the series last year around Christmas time to talk about Paizo's take on the infamous Krampus. Well, since we're in the middle of spooky season again, I thought it was time to revisit this series and take a look at another unique monster that Paizo has developed for their setting, in this case, the Desert's Howl, a monstrous entity famous for stalking caravans in the Thuvian desert, notorious for its ability to cause people's worst nightmares to take physical form and assault them. In today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at the creature known as the Desert's Howl. I'm going to talk about both its lore and game mechanics, and talk about how it could be integrated into your campaign. However, as should be evident from this description, this video is full of spoilers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this video into 3 parts. In the first part, I'm going to focus on lore that player characters are likely to encounter early on in a story featuring the Desert's Howl, so that if you are a player in a Pathfinder game and this creature sounds like something you might be interested in seeing at some point, you can get the elevator pitch to send to your GM so they can search for more information. Then, in the second part, I'm going to move to some of the more behind-the-scenes lore that a game master interested in using the Desert's Howl might want to be aware of. And then finally, in the last section, I'm going to talk a little bit about the mechanical approach and options associated with the Desert's Howl, so that a game master who wants to use this creature has an idea of how best to use them inside of a campaign. Now, while spoilers will abound throughout this entire video, the spoilers in Section 1 are going to be relatively light, and I feel like players can watch Section 1 of this video without having too much of the fun spoiled for them. So I will throw up a spoiler warning before we get to Section 2, where I'm going to get into the more Game Master side of the screen, and at that point, if you're a player who's interested in dealing with this creature at some point, I would advise that you step away from the video, but by all means send your Game Master this way to see if this is something that they might be interested in using. Also, while I do realize that this is a channel that focuses on Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and the specific stats I'm going to discuss in Section 3 are using Pathfinder 2e stats, the reality is Paizo has some of the best setting writers in the entire TTRPG industry, at least in my opinion, and I feel like they've done a good job developing the lore of this creature and giving an outline of what this creature should be able to do, meaning that even if you prefer a different particular TTRPG, this video still might be interesting to you, as it might help give you an outline of something fun that you could develop or homebrew into your own setting. Also, speaking of terrifying entities, we do have to appease the algorithm, so this is going to be the portion of the video where I remind you, please do all of that YouTube stuff that helps support the channel. Like the video, share the video, subscribe if you haven't already. You can also check out my free Discord and my Patreon. Those will be linked in the video description, along with some links related to this creature where you can read up more about the particulars of today's topic. Though, again, if you are a player in a Pathfinder 2e game, you may want to avoid those links to avoid any particular spoilers. These Monster of Myth videos are a lot of fun for me because I like talking about some of the cool lore stuff that Paizo does, but as this material is oriented more towards the storyteller side of the screen, these videos aren't quite as popular, so anything you can do to show some support to the channel is really appreciated. But with all that out of the way, let's get started. So in this first section, I'd like to talk a little bit about the lore surrounding the Desert's Howl that is going to be kind of from the player's side of the equation. I'm going to talk about the kind of information that a player character would be likely to discover about the Desert's Howl very easily inside of the campaign setting. I want to talk about the kind of things that a PC is likely to know or at least suspect about the Desert's Howl. And I also want to talk a little bit about how or why a player character might be interested in engaging with a story related to the Desert's Howl. So, from a big picture perspective, the Desert's Howl is definitely played up as a mysterious monster, a creature that stalks caravans across the desert wastes, and that is very rarely seen right up until the very moment that it attacks and destroys its victims. The Desert's Howl, in many ways, plays like that classic monster movie trope of it is almost more mystery than monster, in that there are so few survivors or so few direct witnesses that it's hard to pin down a lot of specifics about what this creature is or what is going on with the Desert's Howl. The general information around Thuvia about this creature describes the Desert's Howl as a 9-foot-tall, monstrous humanoid-like creature with a horned head resembling an ibex and long clawed hands. But beyond that, there are not a lot of concrete descriptions. You get some glowing eyes, you get a shadowy figure in the distance, but in keeping with the idea of a shadowy monster stalking its prey, there just aren't a lot of up-close descriptions of what this creature happens to look like. The Desert's Howl is described as terrorizing caravans for a period of at least 3,000 years, and while not much is necessarily known about its physical description or abilities, what is known about this creature is that it enjoys tormenting its prey. It seems to feed off of fear, and it will often hunt its prey over a period of several days, driving them insane with horribly vivid nightmares, before finally cornering them, isolating them, and finishing them off. Naturally, there are all sorts of rumors that surround this particular creature, including questions of whether or not it is truly a unique creature, or if there are multiples of this creature somehow hunting across the Thuvian waste, or is it possible that the Desert's Howl may be beginning to spawn offspring, creating some sort of terrible monstrous species that is ready to prey upon humanity. That's the general description that player characters are likely to get, but even if specifics are hard to pin down, that doesn't mean that there aren't any legends about where this creature comes from or how this creature came to be. The most common legends about the origin of the Desert's Howl center around a famous bandit or highwayman that went by the name Jalari Zafikiri. During his life, he was a highly successful bandit, and he became fantastically rich as a result. According to legend, Zafikiri went to great lengths to hide the spoils of his banditry in various hidden locations all around the Thuvian desert. As his wealth and power grew, Zafikiri eventually decided that he wanted to retire and enjoy all of the spoils of the dangerous life that he had lived, but he decided he needed to pull one last heist before he ended his career. Now, the specifics of that heist have been lost to time, but according to the various stories you might be able to dig up, whatever it is that Zafikiri chose to do, he angered a lot of people. Where normally the consequences of his antics were something that he could duck away from for a short period of time and then safely return to his normal career, this particular heist caused him to earn very powerful enemies that pursued him relentlessly across the desert waste forcing him to move from hiding spot to hiding spot until eventually the only place that was safe for him was among one of his secretly hidden treasure caches. As he waited, he came to the realization that his hunters were never going to give up on their chase, and he became increasingly desperate. What happened next is not truly known, but the man that was once Jalari Zafikiri later emerged from his treasure hoard, changed in a terrible fashion, and that terrible curse that had taken hold of his body also began to take hold of the desert as well, and that is when the first nightmares of the desert's howl began to manifest themselves. Scholars of dark occult secrets suspect that the form of the desert's howl is a twisted reflection of the likely terrible hunger that Zafikiri would have experienced as he desperately tried to avoid his pursuers, and some think that it is the twisted mission of the desert's howl to inflict the same kind of fear and desperation on its prey that it once experienced itself. Is any of this the truth? Well, honestly, we don't know. But it definitely makes for an interesting story, and the next thing I'd like to talk about is reasons why player characters might be interested in engaging with the story of the desert's howl. Because, let's be frank, the idea of being pursued by a terrible monstrous creature across the desert as you slowly go mad and starve to death is not most people's idea of fun, and yet many people have tried to chase this creature down. Why? Well, the answer's pretty obvious. It's rumored that this creature is linked to hidden caches of gold. Yes, there you go, clear-cut adventure motivation right on the front page. It is rumored that Jalari Zafikiri went to such extreme lengths to hide his treasure hoards that no one was ever able to uncover the majority of their storage locations, and that the key to finding these legendary treasures came in the form of Jalari's Coded Necklace, a series of golden coins with weird maps etched into them by the point of an awl. From time to time, around the markets of Thuvia, different coins that are said to be a part of this necklace have appeared, and whether they are genuine or not, people will often go to great lengths to obtain them in the hopes that they can be the ones to discover this long-hidden treasure. The fact that this long-hidden treasure may also be the lair of a terrible monstrous creature ready to eat them, that's hardly going to deter an adventurer. That being said, if you're a player who's interested in the desert's howl, you don't necessarily have to begin with the motivation of gold. I really enjoy the nightmarish aspect of this monster, and it's really easy to imagine a background related to this monster where a caravan that your character was a part of may have been attacked by this creature, and you are possibly one of those survivors who was afflicted with terrible nightmares for a time, and now you have set out in an effort to discover what this creature was and maybe take revenge for what it did to you. In any case, that kind of covers the common lore associated with the desert's howl. So at this point, I'm going to move on to the lore that is focused more towards the Game Master side of the screen. Players, at this point, if you want to avoid some major spoilers, I definitely recommend stopping the video here. But as I said, send your storyteller this way to see if they might be interested. But now, storytellers, let's dig a little bit deeper. Okay, so storytellers, if you're interested in using the desert's howl, let's talk a little bit more about the lore of this creature, and I want to begin with a big picture observation that's going to sound like a criticism, but it's not. And that is, the desert's howl is a really generic, unique monster. Okay, I'll dig into this a little bit more when we get to the mechanics section on this creature, but one of the things you will notice as you are reading through the lore on the desert's howl is Paizo really plays up the idea that there is a lot of unknowns surrounding this creature. Everything is a maybe, a might, a could be, a badly remembered encounter by a half-mad survivor. Every detail on the desert's howl comes with a giant asterisk labeled, "This could all be false." If nothing else, take the number 3,000 years from the legend of Jalari Zafikiri. 3,000 years that this creature has hunted the deserts of Thuvia. That's a really, really long time. And that point alone should really underline the fact that when it comes to the desert's howl, every piece of information on this creature is unreliable. Everything I just said to the players, in fact, everything I'm about to tell you on the more Game Master side of the lore, everything is presented in a very unreliable way, and as a storyteller, I honestly think one of the most important points with this creature is you definitely should put your own spin on this creature, because not everything is true or even should be true when it comes to dealing with it. Now, as for the story of Jalari Zafikiri, Paizo does offer some possible explanations for how Zafikiri may have become this corrupted creature known as the Desert's Howl. The theme of starvation does seem to be pretty prominent, and of all of the lore surrounding this creature, the theme of starvation is probably the closest to official. So in interpreting this creature for your campaigns, I would definitely consider drawing inspiration from other famous monsters that also play on those themes of starvation, because it does seem very appropriate to the creature. However, Paizo does offer some possible answers for what Zafikiri did to try to escape his desperate dilemma. Two options in particular stand out as very interesting possibilities. One possibility is that Zafikiri, in the course of his banditry, had come into possession of a Ring of Wishes, and that he attempted to use the Ring of Wishes to escape his dilemma, but when he did, he realized all too late that that Ring of Wishes was corrupted in one fashion or another, and the wish that he used was turned back against him, transforming him ultimately into the creature known as the Desert's Owl. The other possibility, which I find very, very interesting, is that Zafikiri actually attempted to drink a Sun Orchid elixir, which in Golarion lore is one of the most famous minor artifact level items in the setting. Thuvia essentially sells Sun Orchid elixirs as these low-grade elixirs of immortality, if you will. And if you take that rumor that Zafikiri's last raid earned him powerful enemies, well, stealing a Sun Orchid elixir would do exactly that. The possibility that Zafikiri had gotten a hold of a Sun Orchid elixir and attempted to use that to save himself from that dilemma is actually pretty feasible and also very interesting. Paizo presents the distinct possibility that Jalari Zafikiri had one of these Sun Orchid elixirs, attempted to drink it in an effort to save his life, but this elixir was, for one reason or another, ineffective. Is it possible that Zafikiri accidentally spoiled the elixir and drank what was essentially a poisoned version of this powerful effect? Who knows? Those two options, the Ring of Wishes and the spoiled Sun Orchid elixir, are two very tantalizing possibilities, but there is another thread that Paizo hints at that could also explain the origin of the Desert's Howl, and this particular option could exist completely separate from the story of Zafikiri, or possibly alongside of, and that is that the Desert's Howl is actually the result of Lamashtu. The mother of monsters created this creature and set it loose on the Thuvian deserts for reasons that are entirely her own. This is particularly intriguing because it makes the whole legend of Zafikiri such a fun plot point in the story of the Desert's Howl. On one hand, you could have a scenario where some version of Zafikiri's story is true, and then he makes a deal with Lamashtu in order to save his life. But then, on the opposite extreme, you could have a situation displaying the savage cunning of Lamashtu in creating this creature and then spinning a false tale around the creature to lure people into hunting it when in fact there's no actual gold for them to find. When we talk about the mechanics of the Desert's Howl, the creature itself is presented as a level 19 monster, and we'll talk a little bit about the suggestions that Paizo gives for integrating this story throughout the whole of a campaign. But one of the problems with such a high-level creature is the fact that a 19th level creature is just really hard to effectively insert into the beginning of a campaign and then keep in the background for that big of a period of time. So if you're a storyteller who's interested in using the Desert's Howl, I would strongly recommend using the Church of Lamashtu as maybe a primary antagonist for the story, and then using that to springboard into adventures featuring the Desert's Howl. And you could kind of go back and forth between those two, and I think that would carry a long campaign a lot more effectively than just trying to use the Desert's Howl by itself. Now, in the discussion of the Desert's Howl, there is a long section that is annoyingly mechanics-free, and that is the discussion of the Desert's Curse. According to the story, over the past 3,000 years, as the Desert's Howl has prowled the desert, its nightmarish abilities have slowly corrupted portions of the land, leading to an insidious curse that is slowly spreading its way across the desert. As such, it is entirely possible that a creature may be nowhere near the Desert's Howl itself, and yet still come into contact with something that has been corrupted by its power. Now, curses exist as afflictions in Pathfinder 2e, but in this section on the Desert's Curse, it gives us no mechanics, meaning that the Desert's Curse could make for some very interesting story points to further flesh out using this creature, but if you do, as a storyteller, you're going to have to decide on your own how you want to reflect that mechanically. There are some strong hints that the Desert's Curse may be how the Desert's Howl is trying to essentially reproduce or get more of itself into the world. There are some alternative creatures called Spawn that we'll also talk about in a moment that are implied to be the results of this curse. But again, there are no hard or definitive stats, so as a storyteller, you're going to have to decide exactly what you want to do with this. One last thing I'd like to note on GM lore, Monsters of Myth actually gives you 2 sample NPCs that were survivors of a caravan that was struck by the Desert's Howl, and both of these sample NPCs are worth reading for the sheer entertainment value alone, because they both definitely come across as at least slightly mad as a result of their experiences. Both stories definitely come with a hint of, can this person be trusted, or have their memories been twisted somehow? What can we take, and what should we leave aside? If you're a storyteller who wants to use the Desert's Howl, definitely read up on both of the NPCs that Paizo gives you, and use those as a model for some other survivors that you might want player characters to meet, because with the Desert's Howl, the unreliability of the information around this creature is a major selling point of what makes this creature effective. So when players are trying to learn more, you want to give them sources that they can't quite trust all the way. I think that's an important point in making the story of this creature more engaging. But now, let's go ahead and talk about the actual mechanical expression of this creature, what Paizo did to design the Desert's Howl as something that players might have to face. So, as I mentioned, the Desert's Howl is a unique level 19 creature that is featured in Monsters of Myth, and there will be a link to its stat block from Archives of Nethys in the video description. So if you want to see all of the specifics, you can go down there and check this creature out. One thing I would like to point out about the Desert's Howl is when you look at the stat block of this creature, it's not a desert creature. At least, for the most part, not really. When you look at the Desert's Howl, I'll go ahead and tell you this, the creature is resistant to fire and weak to cold. And beyond that, nothing in its abilities specifically call out this creature has to live in the desert. Paizo went out of their way to tie this specific creature to the deserts located in the nation of Thuvia, and by all means this creature works in the Thuvian desert, but one thing I want to say to storytellers watching this video is you can totally transplant this monster just about anywhere and it would totally work. With minor stat block alterations, you could put this creature in a frozen wasteland, or you could have this creature stalking around some small islands where ships commonly wreck and where sailors wash ashore with little supplies to their name. This is a creature that easily could appear in a lot of different settings, and it would work very well. Most of the abilities that the Desert's Howl have center around the use of illusion or the use of fear tactics in one way or another. In fact, this creature has Frightful Presence as an ability, which is something that you see commonly in monsters of this design. As I've already mentioned, there are some spawn of the Desert's Howl that are also included in Monsters of Myth. These are level 11 creatures, and the level 11 versions of these creatures are, apart from the fact that they've been powered down to level 11, identical in a lot of ways. They're weaker across the board, but their abilities don't change very much, and their actual application in play would be very, very similar. So really, if you don't want to use the level 19 version because you think it's just too high level and you don't want to wait that long, you could honestly drop one of the level 11 creatures into your game and just give it the exact same lore, and I feel like most players would never notice the difference. As I said in the lore section, the Desert's Howl is kind of a generic monster. It plays with these themes of illusion and fear and nightmares and things like that, common horror tropes that honestly can be transplanted anywhere you want them to. The point of this creature is not it has to be used this specific place, this specific way, but more, this is a model creature that game masters can take, and with a few small adaptations, put in any environment, and I think it would work really, really well. Now, I'm not going to go over every single ability that the Desert's Howl has, because, well, the stat block's linked below, you can just go read it. However, I do want to point out some of the important abilities, and how they should be used inside of your story to make this creature effective. First off, I want to point out that the Desert's Howl is going to come with two abilities that really just say plot. That is the ability Fear Scent and Aura of Agony. Fear Scent is essentially an ability that allows the Desert's Howl to track creatures that are afraid of it by scent. This is a horror genre staple. I absolutely love it. I'm glad the creature has it. But to a large extent, this basically just says the creature knows how to find you regardless of what you're doing. As for Aura of Agony, this is a ridiculously large aura that causes creatures in the area of the Desert's Howl to potentially have their worst nightmare take physical form and attack them. Given that most player characters are probably not going to be asleep while they're fighting the Desert's Howl, it is quite obvious that the Aura of Agony ability is mostly there as a way of allowing the whole Nightmares Made Flesh thing to have a mechanical source inside the game. Ergo, when you read Fear Scent and Aura of Agony, really what you're reading is plot powers for the monster. The book gives you some guidelines on how to use them, but honestly, that's what those powers are there for. There are, however, a couple of abilities that are clearly intended to be used in tandem that are a much better reflection of how this creature actually fights, and I really like this combo. One of the abilities is a reaction called Putrid Evanescence, and the second is an ability called Illusory Ambush. Putrid Evanescence is a reaction that allows the Desert's Howl to vanish if a creature would cause it damage, and when it vanishes, it teleports to any space within 100 feet, and when it arrives at that space, it arrives invisible, meaning that if creatures can't see invisibility, they're not going to know where this creature necessarily went. Then you have an ability called Illusory Ambush, which is a 2-action activity where basically the Desert's Howl is going to attack a target while it's invisible, and in addition to dealing all kinds of damage, inflict some really powerful frightened debuffs on the target because they have no idea where the assault is coming from. Also, it's worth noting here that with the variety of ways that the Desert Howl has to inflict the frightened condition, it also comes with some unique rules that can prevent characters from removing the frightened condition the way they normally would. They're going to need a longer period of time or magic or some other more significant means of dealing with the fear that this creature causes. The Desert's Howl is also going to come with a Howl special ability that also comes with some pretty potent frightened debuffs, and if creatures critically fail their save against this Howl, they can also gain the Doomed condition on top of the frightened condition, which is just a fun little extra edge added to the encounter. However, there is a distinct portion of the Desert Howl's stat block that you need to be aware of as a game master. This is something you don't want to overlook, That is the Paralytic Secretion and Profane Feast abilities. You see, when you look at the Desert's Howl, it's really easy to focus on all of the illusion, all of the fear effects, all of the different ways that this creature plays with the mind of its enemies, and kind of forget that the creature needs to be a physical threat as well. This is a level 19 creature. It is one of the most dangerous things in its entire environment, and if players actually get toe-to-toe with this creature, it shouldn't be a pushover. Part of the way Paizo helps to keep this creature a genuine threat once you manage to hunt it down is through the use of Paralytic Saliva that can essentially lock a target out of the fight. On top of that, the Desert's Howl is more than willing to grab a target and start snacking on them while they're still alive, as exemplified by that Profane Feast ability I previously mentioned. For a creature that savors the fear of its prey, I think it's an extra special sadistic touch to have a creature that feeds on the fear of its prey have an ability that allows it to start feeding on its prey while they're still alive. Now, stepping outside the stat block, Paizo does discuss how you can use the Desert's Howl in your campaign, and they break this into 3 general tiers of play, and how you might use the Desert's Howl in each of those tiers. They use low-level campaigns, mid-level campaigns, and high-level campaigns, and essentially in a low-level campaign, your players should not be going up against the Desert's Howl, against any of the spawn creatures that are described, because they're not going to stand a chance. Instead, at low levels especially, you can play around with the idea that the Desert's Howl or the Desert's Curse can cause people to literally be attacked by their own nightmares. Have characters who are traveling through the desert make some will saves, and if they fail, have creatures spawn out of thin air to assault them that they then have to fight off. Paizo even goes out of their way to point out that this is a great opportunity to drop non-desert creatures into your desert adventure and give them a way to actually be there to kind of spice up the kind of combat your players are dealing with. So during low-level play, it's completely valid for one of your players to have a nightmare about an ice dragon and then wake up and have to fight an ice dragon even though they're in the middle of the desert. Also mentioned as possible threats for low-level play would be survivors of an attack of the Desert's Howl, as the survivors would have been assaulted by terrible illusions and other mental attacks. It's entirely possible that players might find themselves trying to deal with survivors who cannot differentiate between the real world and the world of their nightmares, and PCs might have to struggle with finding ways to take down survivors non-lethally and restore them to health, or put them out of their misery if no such options are available. Moving into mid-level play, the spawn that I mentioned earlier become available as an antagonist that you can use against your players, and like I mentioned before, as they are essentially leveled down versions of the main creature themselves, if you don't want to go to high-level play, you could totally use one of the spawn as the Desert's Howl. It would fit. But even if you don't, PCs still might have to take down some of these creatures, or might have to take down people that are being twisted into the shape of these creatures. They represent a real danger that you can send your players against, and allow your players to get out into the desert and begin hunting the Desert's Howl itself. Of course, at high-level play, suddenly the Desert's Howl becomes a major threat that you can send your players against, and depending on the level of the party, you might be able to mix a few of its spawn in to add some variety to the encounter. At any point along the way, you can mix in foes from the Church of Lamashtu, or possibly some cursed gold coins related to the myth of Zafikiri we discussed before. Those can be dropped in at any point to kind of spice up what you're doing with this creature. As I've mentioned, the Desert's Howl as written in Monsters of Myth is a little bit generic, and I think over the course of a true 20-level campaign by itself, the Desert's Howl probably couldn't do the work you needed it to do. But if you mix this creature in with something like the Church of Lamashtu as a major foe, I think you could get a lot of mileage, and it could be an interesting story to weave in and out of a main campaign. But with all that being said, the time has come for me to turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about the Desert's Howl, And if you're a storyteller, is this the sort of creature that you would enjoy adding to your campaign? Let me know how you might use the Desert's Howl in your story, and let me know if you agree with my assessment that this is a creature that you could easily adapt to other environments and not just leave locked into the location of Thuvia itself. Also, if you're a storyteller who has used the Desert's Howl in a campaign, please jump down to the comments section and let me know. I'd love to hear how that story turned out. Don't forget all the other YouTube stuff, like, share, and subscribe. You can also check out Discord and Patreon. But as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Happy Halloween.